Hello, my name is Dr. Neil Richardson. I'm a lecturer and also the unit coordinator for this unit LSN 104, that is Advancing Anatomy and Physiology. So once again, welcome to this unit. In today's unit, we're going to provide a basic overview of some of the central themes and concepts that will be embedded within this unit. We'll begin with a brief definition of what human anatomy is and what physiology is, and we'll also have a look at some of the subdivisions of human anatomy. We will then start to look at the human body and consider some of the major regions within it, and in particular look at some of the body cavities where many visceral organs are found. From there, we'll define some of the major levels of structure within the human body, starting with the very simple ones, that's the molecular or chemical levels, and progressing to more complex levels such as organs and organ systems. We'll then have a quick look at the major organ systems within the body and identify a few of the specific organs that are found in each of those systems. We'll then move over to some definitions of anatomical terminology. It's a very specific language that's used in the description of the human body and the structure of the human body. We call that anatomical terminology. We will look at things like the standard anatomical position, anatomical, directional and spatial terms, and we will finish our lecture today with a brief definition and description of some of the basic characteristics of living cells in the human body. Now we'll start with a description of what anatomy actually is. It's derived from an ancient Greek word which essentially means to cut up or cut apart. Now the key thing here is that we are talking about the structure of the human body. We will be describing what something is called and where you find it. And here we have an example of how we would study human anatomy. Here is a human skeleton. Now if we are studying the anatomy of the human skeleton, we are interested in what these structures are actually called and where they are located and how do they relate to each other. Here, for example, we have highlighted the bones of the lower limbs. We have here the femur, and the femur is here sitting on top of the tibia. So that's the sort of thing we do in anatomy. We study what things are called, what they look like, where you find them, and how they relate to other adjacent structures. So we've described what anatomy means. We're talking about structure. Now when we're looking at anatomy, there are several different ways we can do this, and there are four main types of anatomical study. We have gross anatomy. That is where we study body structures without the use of magnification. And much of what we will be doing in LSN 104 will be gross anatomy. In many cases, you may need to look at the microscopic structure of something. You may need to examine tissues or cells within a particular structure. That is what we call histology. If we are focusing our attention on the structure of a particular organ system, such as the cardiovascular system, we might call that systemic or systematic anatomy, focusing on a particular organ system. And finally, we can look at a particular region of the body, such as the brachial region, which is commonly referred to as the arm, and in that study we would examine all the features within it. So we might look at muscle tissue, skin, bone, nerves, for example, in a particular region. So, anatomy is the study of structure. The other major concept we'll be dealing with in this unit is physiology. Physiology refers to functions of the body, and we often focus on the activity of what's in that region at the cellular or molecular level. Here I have an example of how we might look at physiology. There's a heart here. If we were studying the anatomy, we would focus our attention on the heart chambers and the blood vessels. If we're studying the physiology, we would be interested in the function of the heart. How much pressure does it generate when it pumps blood? How effectively is it working? What sort of electrical activity is running through the heart tissue to coordinate its contraction? And here we have an ECG trace, which is actually measuring the electrical activity going through the heart. This is particularly important because this electrical activity coordinates the contraction of the heart chambers. So anatomy is structure, physiology is function. Often you will study them hand in hand as they are complementary concepts. What we'll do now is we'll talk about different levels of structural complexity in the human body. As we saw in a previous slide, you can look at the human body in different ways, without the use of magnification or with the use of magnification. That suggests different levels of complexity, and it's important to understand the differences between those different levels of structural complexity in the human body. There are several different levels we can examine. The simplest level of structural complexity in the human body is the chemical, referring to atoms or molecules which make up the body. We might, for example, be interested in examining the distribution of carbohydrates, lipids, proteins within structures of the human body. Molecules and atoms come together to form more complex structures, and in particular we get to things like the cellular level of complexity. Cells are particularly important as they are the smallest living units of structure in the human body, and we will be examining these in a bit more detail in this unit. Similar types of cells come together to form tissues. There are 4 primary tissues we'll be referring to in this unit, which I'll discuss a little later. So tissues are structures made of similar types of cells coming together to perform a particular function. Tissues provide the basic building materials for the body, and with different tissue types you will construct organs such as the heart, the intestines, and so on. You bring together a number of organs to form an organ system. So the stomach, the intestines, the esophagus, they would make the digestive system. All the organ systems of the body together allow you to create the organism, which in this case is us. This slide here, this just is reinforcing the concept of the different levels of structural complexity. Starting off with the chemical level, we have individual atoms, such as hydrogen here, coming together with other atoms such as oxygen to form molecules such as water. So that is the most basic, the simplest level of structural complexity in our bodies. With molecules we create more complex structures, and by the time we get to cells we reach a level where we're looking at the smallest living units of the human body. So cells is something we will concern ourselves with quite a bit in this unit. With cells you can create tissues. So here we have on this side some individual epithelial cells. We will get a number of these, we will get them together in close association to create a distinct structure we call an epithelial tissue. Beneath that epithelial tissue, which is this region here, you can see a different type of tissue. So this is another type of material created with different types of cells, and the one here performs different functions to the one here. Tissues are the basic building materials we use to create the next level, which is the organ levels. So with epithelial tissues, connective tissues, and other tissues, we create an organ such as the small intestine we can see here. There's another organ there, which is the large intestine. So from tissues we create organs. Now an organ like the small intestine does not exist in isolation. It contributes to an organ system. So here we have intestine, large and small, we have the liver, we have the stomach, all parts of the digestive system. And all the organ systems together create the organism, which in this case is the human body. As I've just mentioned, cells are of particular importance in our study of human anatomy. So when we are looking at the structural complexity of the human body, we often start at this level. The reason is because cells are the smallest living components of the human body. If you look at a cell, they generally possess specialized structural and functional units. Look inside a cell and you'll see typically things such as a nucleus where DNA can be found. You'll find things such as mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum, and each one of those structures carries out a particular function, such as allowing the cell to obtain energy or creating materials that the cell needs to manufacture to sustain itself or to perform a function in that particular organ system. There are a great diversity of human cells in the body, and we will touch upon some of these very soon. Another key concept is that similar types of cells come together to form structures that we call tissues, and that'll be a concept that I'll cover very soon. Before we move on, however, a key thing to realise is that molecules and atoms are not living things. The first living structural unit we find in the human body is the cell, and this is an individual cell here, and there you go, you can see it sort of moving away, and it'll be capable of division as well. So cells, smallest living structural units in the body. Now typically when you look at a textbook, they will represent a generic cell. It will usually be something fairly spherical and fairly indistinct. What's important to emphasize is that a great diversity of cell types exists within the human body. Each cell type performs a specific function. Here are some examples of cells. An oocyte, large spherical cell, it contributes to the reproductive process. Smooth muscle cells, spindle-shaped, contract, and carry out quite different functions to the oocyte. A bone cell, here we have an osteocyte with this sort of spindly-like appearance, with processes, fine processes extending out. Blood cells take on various forms. They can look like donuts, such as here we've got the red blood cells. White blood cells, they can take on different forms as well. This is a very, very different sort of cell. This is a neuron. This serves the body by allowing information to be rapidly transmitted. It looks like something out of a computer circuit, and it functions just like that. So we have different cell types. They look different because they perform different functions. Here's a couple of other cell types. We have the epithelial cells here. I briefly mentioned those before. They tend to be found lining structures. Fat cell, we have this sort of fairly thin, hollow-looking cell, which is filled with a drop of lipid, which can be used for energy storage or thermal insulation or protection from shock. So the key thing to note in here is that cells can be found in many different forms. Each cell looks a certain way because it carries out a different function. And the form of the cell should complement the function that it carries out. Above the cellular level, we reach the more complex level, which is what we call tissues. Tissues are structures made of similar cell types, and they perform specialized functions. The four basic tissue types we have in the human body are epithelial tissues. Here we have tightly packed cells lining the surface of something. This would be lining the trachea, part of your airways. You have connective tissues. Connective tissues are found in things like tendons, the bone, and often they are characterized by sparsely scattered cells with lots of material between the cells, collagen fibers, or gooey ground substance that glues everything together. Muscle tissue functions to allow movement. Cells in muscle tissue contract, and that contraction allows structures to move. Finally, we have nervous tissue, characterized by cells with many extensions, as we saw in the previous slide, facilitating communication through the body systems. Now, a key concept we should consider at this point is what actually a tissue means. A lot of people have trouble with the concept of tissues. I'd just like to emphasize at this point that in simple terms, tissues are like the different basic building materials we require to construct something like a house. In our bodies, we have material we call connective tissue that functions in our bodies to provide support. Connective tissues are things such as the bone, the skeletal tissues, such as bone and cartilage, providing structural support. Epithelial tissues tend to line things and provide protection. Look at the tiles on this roof, lining and protecting the house from the rain. Other tissues you could correlate with things like optic fibers or copper wiring, allowing the transmission of information rapidly. So something like here, we might have a telephone line coming into the house, allowing rapid communication. That correlates approximately with nervous tissues. So just emphasizing once again, tissues are the basic building materials from which we will construct the organs of the body. What I'll do now is just spend a few moments talking about the four primary tissue types, the four basic tissue types. So there are four main ones of those, however there are many subdivisions with each of those primary tissue groups. Let's start off with the epithelial and connective tissue types, the first two. Epithelial tissues are often found lining body structures, either the inside or outside of them. For example, here we have somebody peeling off a little bit of skin here. This is what we call the epidermis. It's part of the epidermis, the outermost layer of the skin. That is composed of epithelial cells, tightly packed cells lining the surface of the skin, providing protection, and it will protect you from elements from the outside, keeps the outside out and the inside in. And these cells, the epithelial cells, tightly packed together, they will prevent dehydration, they will prevent microorganisms entering, and so on, lining and protecting the inside or outside of body surfaces, epithelial tissues. Connective tissues, often you will find those lining or supporting other body structures. And here we have an example of one of those connective tissue structures, a tendon, the calcaneal tendon. This will connect muscles here with bones here. Connective tissues can be solid, such as bone, or they can actually be liquid. Blood is a connective tissue. Typically, when we look at connective tissues, the density of cells is less than something like an epithelial tissue. The other two primary tissue types are the muscle tissues and the nervous tissue. The key function of muscle tissue is to facilitate movement. Muscle tissue cells contract, and when they contract, they allow movement to occur. They allow movement of the musculoskeletal system, or they allow movement within internal body organs such as the heart or blood vessels. There we go. So here we have skeletal muscles. There's the biceps brachii, and when those muscle cells are contracting, they allow movement to occur, as we see here. Nervous tissue is all about the rapid communication of information in the body. Nervous tissue conducts impulses, or what they're actually called action potentials, that allow internal communication and coordination of various body activities. These are found in particular abundance in structures such as the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. So from the tissues, we move to the next level of structural complexity in the human body, which is the organs. The organs are composed of multiple tissue types. So basically, if you get two or more tissue types found in a particular body structure, you can term it an organ. And here we have an obvious example of an organ, the heart. The heart is composed of all those tissue types I've just been talking about. We have epithelial tissue lining the inner surface of the heart chambers and the large blood vessels associated with the heart. We have connective tissue embedded within the wall of the heart, holding everything together. We have muscle tissue within the heart. Most of this material here is cardiac muscle tissue, and that is what contracts and allows the heart to pump blood. We also have nervous tissue associated with the heart. Nerves will come in and help regulate the rate at which the heart beats. So basically, an organ is any structure composed of two or more tissues that carries out a specific function in the human body. Now, it's important to note that organs of the human body are not found in isolation. They integrate themselves with other organs and carry out specific functions that help the body survive. So every organ you look at will be part of a system, and it will help that system carry out its major role. Here we have an example. This shows the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system consists of the heart, we see there, and the blood vessels. Vessels going away from the heart are arteries, vessels returning to the heart are veins. Microvessels, which allow exchange between the blood and the cells of the body, are called capillaries. All of these are part of a functioning system, which we call the cardiovascular system. In this unit, we will spend quite a bit of time focusing on individual organ systems. So what I'm going to do is a very brief overview of some of the main systems that we'll be looking at. Systems such as the integumentary system, commonly referred to as the skin. So the integumentary system includes the skin, that's the dermis and the epidermis, and also other accessory structures associated with it. Fingernails, toenails, hair, sweat glands, oil glands, and so on. Skeletal system consists primarily of the skeleton, which is the bones and the cartilage that links some of those bone structures. So when we look at the skeletal system, we will be focusing our attention on bones such as the femur here. We'll be looking at cartilages that are important for the skeleton, such as those associated with the ribs, the costal cartilages. And we will also be taking note of the way the bones are linked together through structures called joints, because the way we set up a joint is very important for determining the type of movement that occurs there. When we study the skeletal system, we often then refer to the muscular system. So here we have the skeletal muscles of the body indicated, and by considering the arrangement of the skeletal muscles with the skeleton, we can better understand how movement of the human body is facilitated. The muscular system, I should also mention, includes cardiac muscle tissue, which is associated with the cardiovascular system, and there's also smooth muscle, which contributes to organ systems such as the digestive organs, such as the stomach and the intestines, the urinary bladder, and so on. Basically, the muscular system deals with those structures that facilitate some form of movement. Next, we move to the cardiovascular system, which I've briefly introduced you to before. Cardiovascular system involves the heart, which pumps blood through a series of vessels: arteries, veins, and capillaries. The system is very important for delivering nutrients, oxygen, hormones, immune components to the cells of the body and the organs of the body. A system which can be considered an accessory of the cardiovascular system is the lymphatic system. As blood is being pumped around the body, there will be some leakage of the fluid occurring, about 3 litres a day. The lymphatic system allows you to recover fluid that has leaked from the cardiovascular system. So it's an important drainage system. The other very important thing that the lymphatic system does is keep you free from disease. So it has a distinct immune function. Nervous system involves the rapid communication of information around the body. Some of the structures we show you here, the brain, the spinal cord, nerves, are key elements of the nervous system. Now, it's not the only communication system in the body, but it's the central regulator of communication, and it's also very rapid in the way that it communicates. And we will talk about events called action potentials, which are like small electrical charges, which are very important when studying the function of the nervous system. Endocrine system is the other major communication system of the body, and it often works in conjunction with the nervous system. So the endocrine system refers to structures which release chemicals into the blood, and those chemicals have the capacity to act upon other cells. So it's another type of communication between cells. Only in this case it's mediated via the blood, and it's a little bit slower than the nervous system. However, it's still a very important communication system. Highlighted here, we have organs which contribute in some way to the endocrine system. Now, not every organ here indicated is just an endocrine organ. They may have other functions, such as the ovary, which has an important reproductive function as well. The key thing to note is many organs which carry out one function, if they release a chemical into the blood that affects another cell, then they are actually also members of the endocrine system. Over here we have the respiratory system, the lungs, the airways. Very important for allowing us to obtain oxygen. Your body cells need oxygen to survive, and the respiratory system is key to obtaining that oxygen. Digestive system. This is another important system to allow the cells access to the raw materials they need to survive. So cells will need nutrient molecules such as glucose, such as fatty acids, such as amino acids to create or repair themselves or create new cells. And also just to run the basic metabolic activities of the cells, you will need specific nutrient molecules. And so we have the digestive system to allow us to obtain those nutrient molecules from our diet. The urinary system is all about keeping the blood nice and clean and keeping the fluid levels set correctly in the body, what we call fluid homeostasis. This involves the kidneys and associated ducting systems such as the ureter, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. So blood will be passed through the kidneys, impurities in the blood will be filtered out and removed in the form of urine. And also the kidneys have an important influence in controlling fluid levels within the body. Finally, we come to the reproductive systems. The human body, no matter how well we look after it, can only be expected to last several decades, maybe 8 or 9 at best. If we don't create new versions of ourselves at some point during our life, then our species will come to an end fairly rapidly. So the reproductive systems create new individuals. In the females, we have structures such as the ovaries and the uterus. In the males, we have the testes that produce the sperm, associated duct systems and glands that create the seminal fluids. And we'll look at these later this semester. The next thing we will do is talk about some of the standard terms used in anatomy and also physiology, but in particular used in anatomy. Anatomy has a very specific terminology, and there's a good reason for that. The terminology is based on words and types of words that change little over time. A lot of anatomical terminology is based on ancient Greek and ancient Roman language, and that does not change over time. What we have here is the first of our major anatomical terminologies, the anatomical position. Now, if we examine the human body, we will be making comments about structures and their relationships to one another. So we might say something like, the heart is above the urinary bladder, or the brain is above the heart, or the breastbone, the sternum, is in front of the vertebral column. And when we make those sorts of comments, we need to make sure that the human body is positioned in a very specific way, so those statements are in fact true. Now, when we are talking about anatomy, we have the standard anatomical position. This is where we describe the human body as being erect, facing the viewer, feet close together and flat on the floor, arms by the side of the trunk, and the palms facing forward. So if we were describing, for example, the position of the urinary bladder inside here, and if we said it was below the heart, we would be making the assumption that the body was presented in the standard anatomical position. You can also study the body horizontally as well, and there are certain terms we use for those. The horizontal position, where the individual is facing downwards, we refer to that as prone. If the individual is lying on their back facing upwards, that is supine. If the individual is laying on their left hand side, we refer to that as left lateral decubitus. And if we're lying on our right side, it's the right lateral decubitus. The other terms that are important to understand when studying human anatomy are spatial and relative terms. This gives you an indication of the location of organs. Some of the terms, spatial, can be used in isolation because they might be saying something like an organ is located in the ventral region, which is towards the front of the body. So that is without any other reference to any other organ, giving you some information to where you are finding it. A relative term tends to imply that you need two organs, so something is in front of something else or something is to the side of something else. So we just need to keep that in mind, spatial term and relative terms. Relative terms, you're tending to imply something is positioned here in relation to something else. Some terms can be used in both spatial and relative contexts. What I'll do now is just a very quick overview and definition of some of the major relative and directional terms of the human body. Now, it's important that you take a bit of time in the practical where these are explained in detail to work out exactly what they mean, but I'll give a very brief overview now. So what we'll talk about now are those that relate to structures found towards the front of the body or the posterior of the body. If we're talking about anterior, it's a term that implies towards the front surface of the body or the front of something. Posterior is towards the back surface, the back of something. So anterior towards the front, posterior towards the back. Now dorsal has the can also mean the same as posterior. However, it also makes particular reference to the dorsum of the body, the back of the body. So dorsal and posterior can often be used interchangeably. Ventral makes reference to the belly side of the human body, which is typically the anterior location. So ventral and anterior can often be used interchangeably. So here we have anterior or ventral. Here we have posterior or dorsal. These two going towards the back, and over here going towards the front. Other terms we have: medial. This is towards a midline which has been defined. So here's the midline position running through the center of the body, and if we are an organ that is closer to this midline than something else, we call it medial. So we might have something like we've got the heart here is medial to the arm over here. Lateral is the opposite of that. That is where you are going away from the midline. So the arm over here is lateral to the heart that's back here. Superior and inferior, they're other directional terms of the body. Superior is implying towards the head, or it's above something. Inferior, towards the feet, it's typically below something. So the knee here is below the hip. So the knee here is inferior to the hip, whereas the hip is superior to the knee. Proximal and distal are other terms that are typically used. Now these are a couple of terms that can be very confusing for students of anatomy. Basically, if we're referring to proximal, we're referring to something that's closer to a point of origin. So let's consider this upper limb here. Down here we have the wrist, here we have the elbow, here we have the point where the upper limb attaches to the trunk of the body. Now if we were wanting to know what's proximal, we could say something like the elbow is proximal to the wrist. That would mean that the elbow is closer to this point of attachment here than the wrist is. It's in closer proximity. Usually you have to define some other point of attachment or some other reference point when you're talking about things being proximal or distal to each other. So define the point of attachment, here the shoulder, and then you can say this thing here, the elbow, is proximal to the shoulder when comparing it to the wrist. The opposite occurs with distal. You are going further away from, you're getting more distant. The wrist is distal to the elbow if the point of attachment is defined here at the shoulder. Other terms we can use are superficial or deep. These are opposites of each other. Superficial is a reference to something being closer to the surface of that structure. So if you are something like the skin, you're on the exterior of the body. You are closer to the body surface than, say, something like the kidney is. So the skin is a superficial structure, particularly when you compare it with other structures such as the kidneys. Deep, this is where you go deeper into the body. So here we've got something like the liver, which is deep to the skin. So the skin is this superficial structure out here. Deep to the skin we have structures such as the liver. So superficial, towards the body surface. Deep, away from the body surface, more internal. A couple of other terms that you may come across when studying anatomy, the terms contralateral and ipsilateral. We tend not to use these terms terribly much in anatomy, but it is worth mentioning, particularly if you're referring to, for example, neural injuries. So contralateral, this is where something affects or something on the opposite side of the body. So if we have, for example, a brain injury over here on this side of the body, it may affect the other side. If we're talking about directional terms, you could say something like the right eye is contralateral to the left cheek on the other side of the body. Ipsilateral means on the same side of the body. So left eye, ipsilateral to the left cheek. Left eye, left cheek, ipsilateral. But these terms often tend to be used in reference to things like injuries, where an injury on one side of the body is affecting something on the other side of the body, contralateral, or an injury on one side of the body affecting something on the same side of the body, ipsilateral. From there, we'll move to our next important concept in anatomy, is planes of reference. Now, in this unit, you will be confronted with models and sections that are cut up in very specific ways. And it's important to understand how the body part has been cut, because if you don't understand that, it will look quite different if it's cut through a horizontal plane to a vertical plane, and it can cause a lot of confusion. So when you look at something, a human body part or organ, consider how it has been cut and presented to you. There are several main ways we can describe these imaginary planes of section in the body. In a frontal plane, we will make a section like this, where we are separating surfaces on the anterior aspect of the body or a body structure from the posterior aspects. If we do a transverse plane, we are separating superior structures from inferior structures. If we do a mid-sagittal or parasagittal plane, we are separating structures on the right side from the left side. Mid-sagittal runs through the midline of the body. Parasagittal is parallel to that. Our next major concept relating to anatomical terminology relates to the cavities found within the human body. Body cavities are spaces confined by muscular walls where most of the internal organs can be found. So these confined spaces, typically you have walls made of muscle or bone containing the internal visceral organs. Two major ones are the dorsal cavity, that contains the brain, and the spinal cord. So the cranial cavity is a subdivision of the dorsal cavity. The cranial cavity contains the brain. Another part of the dorsal cavity is the vertebral cavity that encloses the spinal cord. We will look at the dorsal cavity in detail when we study the nervous system. The ventral cavity is the other major cavity. The thoracic cavity contains pleural cavities, pericardial cavities, mediastinum, and the abdominal pelvic cavities, and we'll discuss these in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. The key thing is, however, to understand what a body cavity is. So here we have the exterior surface of the body, and we're looking here at the abdomen and the lower thorax. So let's now remove the outer wall, and here we can see the ribs over here, you can see muscles. So you have this bony muscular wall containing a whole range of soft visceral organs. These are the intestines, mesentery, gallbladder, liver, and there's the stomach there, and you'd have the thoracic diaphragm there. So this is the abdominopelvic cavity. It is a cavity bound by bone and muscle that encloses these soft visceral organs. That's a good example of a body cavity. What I'll do now is describe in detail the specific components of each major body cavity. Firstly, the dorsal or posterior body cavities towards the dorsum or the back of the body. The two main components of the dorsal body cavity is the cranial cavity, which houses the brain, the vertebral cavity, which houses the spinal cord. Ventral body cavity is the much larger one, and we will tend to study that in more detail in this unit. Now, within the ventral body cavity, as you can see here, there are various subdivisions. So with the ventral body cavity, the first major distinction we can make is separating them into the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. The big partition between those two cavities is the muscular thoracic diaphragm, which helps facilitate breathing. If we focus on the thoracic cavity, we can also find other regions that are worth mentioning. Here we have the lungs. They are lined by a membrane that contains a cavity. We call that the pleural cavity. The heart here is lined by a membrane that contains a cavity. That is called the pericardial cavity. The region here, superior to the heart, is referred to as the mediastinum. This is the superior mediastinum. The mediastinum actually extends downwards, but we've emphasized it here to show the heart with its pericardial cavity. So mediastinum, pleural cavity, pericardial cavities. Abdominal pelvic cavity can be subdivided into two, the abdominal one and the pelvic one. And the division here, the pelvic cavity typically being described as the region which is enclosed by the bones of the pelvis, the coxal bones and the sacrum of the vertebral column enclose the pelvic cavity. A lot of what we study in this unit will refer to the abdominal pelvic cavity and the thoracic cavity. When we were talking about organ systems and individual organs, we will often refer to regions of the human body. Now, there are sort of common regional terms that most of you will be familiar with. These are terms that are not confined to those studying the specifics of anatomy. These are terms that are used by the general population. Terms like upper limbs, lower limbs, the head, neck, thorax, abdomen, pelvis, and so on. So these are terms used by the general population to describe specific regions of the body. If you are a student of anatomy, you will need to be familiar with more complex, specialized anatomical terminology. Now, this seems a bit intimidating at first. Don't worry, we don't need to learn in detail every single term here. This is more of a reference for you to come back to when we are referring to the location of specific components of organ systems in future lectures. Now, I mentioned previously that anatomical terminology is typically derived from ancient Greek or ancient Roman language. And the reason that that's been done is because those languages do not change over time, so they retain their meaning. So many of the terms that you see here, they are derived from these ancient languages, and they will not change over time. Here we have the anterior presentation of the body, showing some of the major anatomical regions, and this is the posterior presentation. So what we'll get you to do in the practicals is go through some of the most important of these anatomical regions and define where they are, and then week in, week out, we will keep referring back to them, and hopefully by the end of the semester you will be familiar with the terminology to define the specific anatomical regions of the body. In this section of the lecture, we're going to change track a little bit now. Previously we've done an overview of anatomy. We've talked about the major ways we can study human anatomy. We've talked a bit about physiology. We've talked about the terminology used in the description of body structures as well. Now we're going to move along to the cell. We're going to talk about some of the basic characteristics of living cells. This is important because every body structure that you are made of is created by a living cell. So these are the basic living structural units of the body. So how they are set up, how they appear, and how they are functioning has a critical influence on your body structures and functions. So, a human cell, defined as the smallest living unit of the body. All our body structures and functions are dependent upon the different cells that we have. We have different cells that look different, doing different jobs. Each one of those cells contributes something to the function of us as a functioning human organism. Key thing to note is that since cells are living, they need a constant source of materials. They need raw materials such as amino acids, other nutrient molecules, they need oxygen, they need things to survive to allow them to repair or create new structures, or just to carry out their basic metabolic activities. In particular, they need to obtain energy from the nutrients that we ingest. Without that energy, they die and we stop functioning. Cells will exploit chemical energy in nutrient molecules, and when you do physiology, if you do that, you'll go into great detail about how nutrients are extracted in the digestive system, transported to cells, and then those cells are able to utilize them to create structures or derive energy to run energy-dependent processes. When you look at cells, typically they will be represented in anatomical textbooks in this sort of form, a sort of a blobby spherical structure, fairly indistinct, with a number of structures inside highlighted for you. These internal structures are what we call organelles. Each one of those carries out a particular function that's important for that cell. The nucleus here contains DNA that allows replication and reproduction. Other structures around here carry out different functions, also important for the cell. And in the next slide, we highlight some of the major structures of a cell. Nucleus, as I said before, contains the DNA. The DNA regulates functions that go on in the cell day to day. DNA also allows that cell to replicate and create another version of itself if the tissue needs to grow or repair something. We have other structures such as the endoplasmic reticulum, very important for manufacturing materials the cell needs for itself or to export outside of the cell. Mitochondria are very important organelles for allowing the cell to obtain and utilize energy. The other really important structure that we need to function on is the membrane, what we call the plasma membrane. This is the boundary of the cell, so it separates the inside of the cell from what's outside, and it's very important for regulating how the cell functions, and that'll be our next topic. So the membrane of the cell, often referred to as a plasma membrane, encloses the cell. It's described as a fluid bilayer. Have a think about what that means, fluid. It's not set in stone. There is movement of molecules within this membrane. It's a bilayer containing two layers of material, in particular two layers of lipid molecules. Embedded within that are proteins. These are these purpley looking things here. These proteins carry out a range of functions, and we'll get into that later on. They might allow materials to enter or exit the cell. They might allow the cell to interact with molecules in the external environment. They might help the cell attach itself to other cells or other structures that are important for maintaining structural integrity of a particular body part. Now, if we look at what's inside the cell membrane, I said before there's a bilayer of phospholipids. That's these things that look like spheres with little tails. About half of the membrane is composed of that. The proteins that I've just mentioned, that make up about 45% of the cell membrane, and occasionally we have little offshoots here, these little green molecules here. They are representing carbohydrate molecules. About 5% of the cell membrane is made up of those. Very important for cell-to-cell recognition. Key thing about the cell membrane, separates the internal cellular environment from the external environment. So it's a key factor that influences how the cell interacts with its external environment. One thing we notice when we look at the cell membrane is that it is selectively permeable. This is an important term. It means it allows some materials to go in or out of the cells, but not everything. So it controls the flow of many materials in or out of the cell, and that has very important applications when studying the function of individual cells. This is just emphasizing what I said before. We've increased the power of magnification on the slide to show you those structures again. Main structural components of the cell membrane. Phospholipid molecules. So there's the phosphate charged head facing either outside or inside the cell. The hydrophobic tails, they don't like water, they just tend to associate with each other. You'll also find cholesterol molecules within this bilayer, helping to determine the stability of the membrane and the fluidity. Proteins here, embedded in the cell membrane, very important functions. They help the cell, as I said before, interact with materials outside the cell. They have important structural roles, and they also can have important roles regulating the flow of materials in or out of the cells. Carbohydrates have been indicated here, potentially important for cell-to-cell recognition. So now we're going to talk a bit more about the function of the cell membrane. So it's the phospholipid bilayer. It's like two layers of lipid-like molecules with proteins floating around in it. Now your cells, your living cells, are bathed in a semi-fluid kind of environment, and this environment's very important for the function and survival of the cell. This fluid is a source of nutrients, oxygen as well. hormones, immune components that the cells will need to survive. So that is available in the interstitial fluid. It's also the site where wastes created by the cells are disposed. The cell membrane provides a selective barrier between the cell and that fluid on the outside. It allows molecules the cell wants to come in, such as oxygen or nutrients, they can come in, but unwanted molecules do not have the potential to enter the cell. The movement of substances through the cell membrane is regulated by a combination of what we call passive and active processes. The key thing that distinguishes these two processes is that active requires energy. So here we've got a couple of images. This is just a concept booster. So think of the cell membrane as a security guard trying to keep people from coming into a nightclub who are not invited. So here we have our security guard here. He's acting like the cell membrane. He is selective about who is allowed to enter the club. So here we've got an individual checking the ID. If the ID checks out, if they're the right sort of person for that club, they'll be allowed in. If they don't have the right sort of ID and can't be identified, they won't be allowed in. So your security guard here acting in a selective manner as to what is coming in, and your cell membrane is kind of the same as that. So we've established that the cell membrane is an important regulator of what is moving into the cell or what's moving out of the cell. I also mentioned briefly that the way the cell membrane does this is by passive and active transport processes. A passive transport process requires the cell to invest no energy at all in the transport process. And typically what happens in this case is you have something at a high concentration on one side of the cell membrane diffusing across, moving across to the other side where it is at a much lower concentration. Now this sort of transport is facilitated by simple diffusion through the membrane, through specialized pores. Water, for example, enters this way, through specialized channels, ion channels. So an ion channel is a protein with some sort of hole in it, some sort of tunnel in it that allows a charged atom to move through. Ion channels in the membrane are very important when considering the function of nervous tissue cells and muscle tissue cells. Facilitated diffusion, this is where the process of diffusion occurs with a bit of assistance from the cell, but it doesn't involve investment of energy. There might be just like a specialized protein to help the material come across, but there's no energy investment. The key thing about membrane transport, which is passive, it does not cost the cell anything in terms of energy. Now the ability to understand passive transport needs you to understand a little bit about the process of diffusion. When we're looking at things like fluids or gases, they're at room temperature typically, which is something in the mid-20s, 20 degrees Celsius to 30 degrees Celsius, or if you're inside the human body, up to 37 degrees Celsius. Now at these sorts of conditions, fluids and gases, the atoms within them will be moving, they'll be bumping around, and as they bump into each other, they will tend to spread out over time. That's what we refer to as diffusion. And diffusion refers to movement of gas or liquid molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Now imagine this is a cell membrane. And inside the cell we've got something at a high concentration. If this is a semi-fluid state, these molecules at a high concentration will be bumping into each other, and eventually over time they'll spread out just through random movement. There is no energy investment required by the cell. So let's see diffusion occurring. There you go, high concentration spreading out to a low concentration. And this is a passive transport process, so these molecules can move from one area to another without the cell investing in any energy at all. It's just the movement of the molecules will drive this, their own spreading out, their own diffusion over time. A concept that's associated with this sort of diffusion is one we call osmosis, and this refers to the movement of water across a semi-permeable membrane or selectively permeable membrane such as the cell membrane, And what you get here is water movement from where it's at a high concentration to where it's at a low concentration. So here we have a selectively permeable membrane. The cell membrane is like this. There are holes in it that allow water molecules to move through, but not other larger molecules. So imagine this is a big protein molecule here. It can't move through this little gap. Only the little water molecule can. If we have a concentration here of water molecules, whether it is a high density of them, they'll be bumping into each other, and over time they will start to spread across. They will start moving across the membrane. Oh, here we have another large molecule, it's a salt molecule. So this is typically going on in your cells all the time, this movement of water. There we go. So over time, the water molecules will spread out. So when we are considering the environment that cells are in, it's important to consider the concentration of water either side of the membrane. What you don't want to have happening is a large uncontrolled movement of water from either outside the cell to in the cell, or from inside the cell outside the cell. Either could be quite damaging to the cell. So osmosis is something that needs to be considered when considering cellular function. How is that water moving across the membrane? And how are we preventing excessive movement occurring? These are aspects of cell function that will be considered in more advanced physiology units. But the term osmosis refers to the diffusion of water across these semi-permeable membranes. Membrane channels also allow movement of molecules from inside the cell to the outside, or from outside to inside. And when we study something like the function of nervous tissue or muscle tissue, membrane channels are vital for allowing those cells to operate. Once again, there is no any energy investment by the cell. You simply have this protein here embedded in the cell membrane. There's a channel running through it. On this side of the cell membrane, we have a high density of this particular type of atom or molecule. On this side, the density is much lower. So if we open this channel, you allow these molecules here that are at a high density to move through to where they are at a much lower density. Active transport is a type of membrane transport that involves an investment of energy. And typically the molecule that's required is one called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. It's a specialized molecule that allows the cells to carry energy, to shuttle energy from nutrient molecules to parts of the cell that require that energy. Active transport allows you to operate against concentration gradients. And specifically what that means is, if you have something that's at a low concentration on one side of the membrane, you can actually pump that to an area on the other side of the membrane where that molecule is at a high concentration. So you're fighting the diffusion effect. A good example of a transport system that requires energy is the sodium-potassium pump. Very important for the function of nervous tissue and muscle tissue. The pump is associated with a protein we call ATPase, and what this pump does is it pumps sodium ions out of the cell and pumps potassium ions into the cell. An ion is a charged atom. Na plus is a charged sodium atom. K plus is a charged potassium atom. An electron has been removed from each of these atoms. Now the pumping of sodium and potassium is very important for muscle and nerve cell function. I'm going to expand on that concept in a few minutes, but once again, I'll just take a second to emphasize the concept of active transport. A good example of how we might think of active transport, pumping something against its natural tendency to move the other way, is by looking at a dam. Here we've got a dam. On one side the water level is low, on this side the water level is high. If I was to cut channels into the dam, fluid would by gravity run across to this side from where it's at a high level to a low level. For that downhill movement of water, there would be no energy investment required. Gravity would drive that. If, however, I wanted to top this level up on the high side, I would have to pump water here where it's at a low level up to this level here. that would require me to invest energy in the form of an electrical or petrol operated pump. So active transport is like this model here, where we're fighting the tendency of something to go one way. We fight that tendency by investing energy into some sort of pumping mechanism that pushes it the opposite direction. And here we have the sodium-potassium pump that we see in membranes. It's an active pump. It requires energy to operate. Here's a cell. That's the interior of a cell. That's the exterior of a cell. Here's our cell membrane. Embedded in our cell membrane is this protein, ATPase. Now what it does is it takes as much sodium as it can from the inside of the cell and pumps it out to the cell exterior. So what you end up getting is a high concentration of sodium outside the cell and a low concentration of sodium inside the cell. Na+ is indicating that it's a charged sodium atom or a charged sodium ion. ATP is required to drive this process because the natural tendency of the system would be for the high concentration of sodium to go this way by diffusion. So you have to find that diffusion. To go to low to high concentrations, you invest energy in a pump, and in one cycle of this pump, 3 sodium ions are expelled from the cell interior. The other thing that happens with this specific pumping system is that once the sodium has been pumped outside the cell, the pump will pump potassium into the cell. So here we have the outside of the cell, here we have the inside of the cell. There's the cell membrane, here's our pumping molecule. It's energized, that's what the yellow wriggly line is, by the ATP molecule. The potassium at a low concentration here is attached to the ATP transporter, the ATPase pump, and it is then pumped into the cell. So you are then going to create an environment inside the cell where there's a high potassium concentration, and the potassium concentration outside the cell will be much lower. To sustain that, you need to keep pumping, and every pump cycle will bring 2 more potassiums into the cell. Requires energy. Now, as with anything related to human physiology, there is a definite reason why you have to create this type of environment where on one side there's a high concentration of something and on the other side there's a low concentration of it. You can set up chemical concentration gradients by doing this pumping mechanism. This gives you then potential energy, and the way you can harness that energy is by opening a specialized membrane channel in the cell. So if you have charged ions such as the potassium or the sodium, if you've set up an imbalance in the concentration of those charged atoms across the cell membrane, and then if you open a gate that lets those charged atoms come flooding through, since they're charged, that charge will move with those atoms, and it's kind of like a little electrical current operating. Let's see this work here. So here we've got some charged atoms, membrane here. If we open the gates, oops, beg your pardon, there we go. Let's start from the beginning here. Here we have the charged atoms, not many here. Here we have the charged atoms, lots of them over here. Open the gates, and this is what I was intending to show. There we go, they will just diffuse in, and now they're balanced, and so that will be sustained, that concentration gradient. The only way you can recover to the original situation is if you start then pumping out these ones here and put them back there, and that will cost you energy. But the key thing to note, I'll just run that again. We start, this is like what's happening in your cells. Think of this as the inside of the cell, think of this as the outside of the cell. This might be sodium. The pump that we were looking at before has set a situation up where this sodium atom is all by itself, it's at a very low concentration. Outside the cell, however, the pump's been building up this high concentration of sodium ions. Look at the charge here, each one of those has a positive charge. If we suddenly open a channel that lets sodium diffuse back in, diffusion will allow a number of those to return into the cell. They will bring the charge, so there will be a flow of positive charge from outside the cell to the inside of the cell. And that's pretty much what we see happening when muscles contract or nerves fire off. The key thing is to note that by setting up a concentration gradient, you set up a situation where there can be a rapid movement of electrical charge across the cell membrane. We'll cover this again when we study nervous tissues and muscle tissues in more detail. The last topic I'll talk about now is homeostasis, and that's essentially the body's capacity to maintain internal stability. Now, many of the chemical processes that are essential for sustaining life must be kept within very stable conditions. For example, internal body temperature, fluid levels, and so on. If you fall outside of those normal limits, major problems occur and the individual can die. So what the body has is mechanisms to detect any change in the internal conditions that might cause a problem, and if these conditions go outside of a certain range, then responses are set in place that return the situation back to the most desirable one, to restore internal stability. And virtually all the body organs are involved in homeostasis. To set up a mechanism that maintains homeostasis of something, be it oxygen levels in the blood, be it body temperature, or our salt concentration or something like that, to set up any mechanism to maintain internal stability, you need communication between body cells. And that communication is mediated by the nervous system and the endocrine system. This slide here is just another slide to highlight the concept of homeostasis. So here we have all the body systems shown. Here we have a measure of internal body temperature. Now, it's very important that the internal body temperature keeps itself within this sort of range here, around about 37 degrees, plus or minus half a degree. If we start going outside of that internal body temperature range, many of the chemical processes that are required to sustain life will not run efficiently, and the cells might die, and if the cells die, then the individual dies. So here we have a monitor showing internal body temperature. And what we notice is that the temperature tends to oscillate between very specific ranges. If it goes outside of these ranges, that could be a problem. So clearly there are mechanisms existing within the human body that are set up to maintain this important condition within the body within safe limits. So to maintain homeostasis, internal stability, you must have some sort of mechanism to allow this regulation to occur. What we have when we set up any homeostatic system are a number of components. Firstly, we have the condition that we're interested in. Let's say we're talking about body temperature. Imagine you are confronted with a situation that would tend to promote increased body temperature. So you're out in the sun, for example. The body temperature is constantly being monitored by some sort of receptor, and that's typically something to do with the nervous system. So the nervous system is monitoring those conditions. Information about that condition is sent to a control center. That's typically within the brain. So the receptor recording what's going on with the body temperature, telling the brain what the body temperature is. The body temperature will then be assessed within the control center. If a change needs to be instigated, if we need to cool the individual down or heat them up, a command will be sent to an effector organ. So here we've got somebody getting quite hot. That's been detected by the receptor. The brain has received that information. A decision has been made then to lower the temperature somehow. And one mechanism we could use for that is through sweating. When we sweat, the evaporation of our sweat helps us to cool ourselves. It returns our body temperature to a more effective and safe level. And there you are, much happier. And you could also drink a cool drink too if you wanted to lower your body temperature. So the key thing is maintaining internal stability. You set up a network. The network has the condition that you're monitoring, a receptor to monitor it, a control center, typically the brain, to assess it, and then if a response to keep it within the normal limits as required. You'll have an effector organ, in this case the sweat glands, to make sure that that condition is kept within the safe limits. And this concludes our first lecture. You'll notice that there are a few slides beyond this lecture. I'll just run through them quickly. These have been set in place primarily to allow you to conduct the first practical, where we ask you to identify various structures in the body. So we won't go through these today, just bring these as a reference for your first practical. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the practical.